So we've heard about the pandemic ad nauseum, right? I mean, this whole thing since roughly March of 2020, and COVID and its multiple variants and all the other kind of stuff going on. I don't plan on talking to you about COVID and pandemics, but I did think that there is a bit of an epidemic that is going on. And in my opinion, it's an epidemic of spiritual amnesia, forgetfulness. And it seems to be affecting a lot of us, especially those with whom we associate. So I thought I would talk to you this morning about spiritual amnesia, or I guess you could say father forgetfulness. And the text of the message is taken from Psalm chapter 19, verses 1 through 4. Heaven is declaring God's glory. The sky is proclaiming his handiwork. One day gushes the news to the next, and one night informs another what needs to be known. Of course, there's no speech, there's no words, their voices can't be heard, but their sound extends throughout the world. Their words reach the ends of the earth. What if you were told to stop praying? Just stop praying. What would you do if you were told that? What if you were told to stop talking to God for just a minute and maybe consider him before you speak another word? Solomon warned us not to rush into God's presence with words, because in Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verse 2, Solomon said that's what fools do. The wise man comes to God without saying a word and simply stands in awe before him. It may seem like a hopeless endeavor to gaze at an invisible God, but Paul, writing to the church in Rome in Romans chapter 1, verse 20, tells us that through creation, we see his, as Paul says, invisible qualities and his divine nature. We are a culture, perhaps a world, that relies on technology many times over community. Here's an example. And I don't know that the economy allows us to go out and eat often, but perhaps you have. And have you ever observed when going out to eat, you might look around you, and at the table there might be the typical nuclear family, mom and dad and two kids, and all four of them have their nose in their phone. We are a culture that is reliant upon technology over community. We are a society in which spoken and written words come very cheaply. They are easy to come by, and more often than not, they are excessive. Our culture says anything goes, and a fear of God is almost non-existent. We, unfortunately, many times are very slow to listen, very quick to speak, and we are also sometimes too quick to become angry. Now, thanks to the Hubble telescope and its subsequent replacement called the James Webb Space Telescope, we are now seeing what's been in the universe for thousands, perhaps millions of years, and we didn't even know. For instance, why would God create 350 billion galaxies, and that's just a conservative estimate, which generations of people never saw and never even knew existed? And what I mean by a galaxy is, in very darkened skies, you can see what we call the Milky Way galaxy. and it contains billions of stars within that galaxy. But God has created over 350 billion, as far as we know thus far, galaxies containing hundreds of billions of stars within those galaxies. Why would God do that when nobody can see it and hardly anybody even knew it was there until maybe just recently? Maybe it was to make us say, wow, God, you're just unfathomably big. I know it's caused me to say, God, I think you just really enjoy creating, and the universe just keeps expanding because you really enjoy making stuff. Or maybe it's because God wanted us to respond by looking at the billions of stars and think, who am I compared to God? And how about the other side of creation? Did you know that a caterpillar has 228 separate and distinct muscles just in its head? That's a lot of muscles for a bug, right? And that the average elm tree has approximately 6 million leaves on a single tree. Or have you ever thought about how really diverse and creative our God is? He didn't have to make hundreds of different kinds of bananas, but he did. He didn't have to put 3,000 different species of trees within 1 square mile in the Amazon jungle, but he did. And how about the way plants defy gravity by drawing water upward from the soil into their stems and veins? Or did you know that spiders produce 3 different kinds of silk? When they build their webs, they create 60 feet of silk an hour, while simultaneously producing a special oil on their feet that prevents them from sticking to their own webs. Coral plants, for instance, are so sensitive that they can die if the water temperature changes by a degree or 2. Or did you know that when you get goosebumps, it's the hair in your follicles is really trying to help you keep warm by trapping body heat? Or what about the simple fact that plants take in carbon dioxide, which is poisonous to human beings, and produces oxygen, which we need to survive? I mean, I'm sure you knew that, but have you ever really pondered that? Have you really thought about it for a minute? Whatever God's reasons for his diversity, his creativity, his sophistication in the universe and on earth, and even in our own bodies, the point of all of it is to point to God's glory. God's art speaks for itself, reflecting who he is and what he's like, and that's why we are called collectively to worship him. His art, his handiwork, and his creation all echo the truth that he is worthy of our worship and is glorious. There is no other like him. He is the King of Kings. He is the beginning and the end. He is the one who was and who is to come. But I think, as I suggested to you at the beginning of this message, there is an epidemic of spiritual amnesia that's going around, and frankly, none of us, including myself, are immune to it. You can't get a shot and be inoculated against spiritual amnesia. No matter how many fascinating details we learn about God's creation, no matter how many pictures we see of the galaxies, no matter how many sunsets we watch, we still have a tendency to forget. Most of us know that we're supposed to love and to fear God. Most of us know that we're supposed to read our Bibles and pray so we can get to know God better. Most of us know that we're supposed to worship Him with all of our lives. But actually living it out can be really challenging, right? Frankly, it confuses us when loving God seems to be so hard. I mean, shouldn't it be easy to love a God so wonderful? But when we love God because we feel that we should love Him, instead of genuinely loving Him out of our true selves and our true spirit, we've forgotten who God really is, and our amnesia, unfortunately, flares up all over again. We are programmed to focus on what we don't have. We are bombarded multiple times throughout the day that what we need to buy, we must buy because it will make us happier or sexier or more at peace with ourselves. This dissatisfaction then transfers into our thinking about God, because we forget that we already have all that we need in Him. But because we don't often think about the reality of who God is, we quickly forget that He is worthy of being worshiped and certainly worthy of being loved. So, if the most serious question before us is what God Himself is like, how then do we get to know Him better? We've seen how He's the creator of both the magnitude of the galaxies and the complexities of creatures as simple as a caterpillar. But what's God really like? What are God's characteristics? What are His defining attributes? And how are we then to fear Him, to speak to Him? Well, first, God is holy. Now, a lot of people say that whatever you believe about God is fine for you, so long as you're sincere. In other words, it doesn't really matter what you believe, so long as you're sincere in whatever that belief is, then you're fine. But that would be like one of you describing your friend, for instance, as a 300-pound sumo wrestler, and then in another breath, describe that same friend as a 5'2", 90-pound gymnast. Now, no matter how sincere you are in describing your friend, both descriptions of your friend cannot be true. The preposterous part about our doing this to God is that He already has a name. He already has an identity. We don't get to decide who God is. In Exodus chapter 3, verse 14, God said to Moses, "I am who I am." We don't get to change that. To say that God is holy is to say that He is set apart and very distinct from all of us. Accordingly, there's really no way that ultimately we can ever fathom all of who God is. But God is also eternal, and most of us would probably agree with that statement. But have you ever seriously meditated on what eternal means? You know, each one of us, we had a beginning, right? We have a birth date. And everything in existence began for us and for the world on a particular day, at a specific time. Everything that is except for God. He always has been since before there was an earth, since before there was a universe, since there were before angels. God exists outside of time. And since we are within time, there's no way that we'll ever completely grasp that concept of eternity. And not being able to fully understand God may be frustrating, granted, but it is absolutely ridiculous for us to think that we have a right to limit God to something that we personally are capable of comprehending. I mean, what a stunted, insignificant God that would be. Why would you worship a God like that? For instance, if my mind, let's just say, for example, was the size of a bucket, and God was the size of all of the oceans combined together, it would be absolutely ridiculous for me to say that God is only the small amount of water that I can scoop into my little bucket. That might be part of God, but that is not all of God. Because God is so much bigger. He's so far beyond what we are bound by this time-encased, air, food, sleep-dependent lives that we live. So God is holy. God is eternal. But God is also all-knowing. Now that's a rather intimidating thought, isn't it? Each of us, to some degree, may fool our friends and maybe family from time to time about who we really are. But it's impossible to do that with God. He knows each of us. He knows us deeply. He knows us specifically. He knows our thoughts before we think them, our actions before we commit them, whether we are lying down, whether we are sitting, whether we're walking around. He knows who we are, and He knows what we're about. We can't escape Him, even if we wanted to. And God is also all-powerful. In Colossians chapter 1, verse 16, it tells us that everything was created for God. Because it reads, "For by Him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things were created by Him and for Him." However, sometimes we don't live as though God has created everything. We tend to live as though God was created for us, right? God is like a genie. He's someone to do our bidding. He's someone to bless us. He's someone to take care of our loved ones. In Psalm chapter 115, verse 3, it reveals the following: "Our God is in heaven, and He does whatever He pleases." Yet we keep on questioning Him. Why did you make me with this body instead of that sexier body or younger body or healthier body? I mean, why are so many people dying of starvation, God? Why are there so many planets with nothing living on any of them? Why is my family so messed up? Or even, why don't you just make yourself more obvious to the people who really need to see you? And the answer to each of these questions is simply this: because He's God. Frankly, He has more of a right to ask us why so many people are starving than we do Him. As much as we want God to explain Himself to us, His creation, we are in no place to demand that he give us an account. In the Old Testament book of Daniel, chapter 4, verse 35, it says, "All the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. No one can hold back his hand or say to him, 'What have you done?'" Would you actually want to worship a God who is obligated to explain his actions to you? Or could it be that our arrogance makes us think that God owes us some sort of explanation? Do we really believe that compared to God, quote, "all the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing," and that includes us? Finally, God is just and God is fair. If what we truly, truly deserved were up to us, we would end up with as many different punishments and rewards as people who responded to that question. But it isn't up to us, mostly because none of us are good. That's what Paul said in Romans chapter 3, verse 10. We don't get to set the standards. God is the only being who is good, and the standards are set by him. And because God hates sin, he has to punish people who are guilty of sin. Now, maybe that's not a very appealing standard, but to put it bluntly, when you get your own universe, you can make your own standards. So when we disagree, let's not assume it's his reasoning that needs correcting. Frankly, it takes a lot for us to comprehend God's total hatred for sin. And again, to put it bluntly, Paul said, all have sinned and fallen short of God's glory. Well, that's a pretty inclusive word, and that includes all of us. And again, it takes a lot for us to understand why God would hate sin so much, and we then make excuses. Yeah, I might be a little prideful at times, but everyone struggles with pride. But God says in Proverbs chapter 8, verse 13, "I hate pride and arrogance." In other words, church, you and I are not allowed to tell God how much he can hate sin. He can hate and punish sin as severely as his justice demands. God never, ever excuses sin. He's very consistent with that ethic from Genesis to Revelation. And whenever we start to question whether God really hates sin, well, we only have to think of the cross, where his only begotten Son was tortured, mocked, beaten, and murdered because of sin. Was it Christ's sin? No. Whose was it? Ours. So there's no question about it, church. God hates and has to punish sin, and he's totally just and fair in doing exactly that. So going back to my first comment to you, should you stop praying? No, you shouldn't stop praying. But the next time you approach our Creator of a billion galaxies, and the Maker who knew you intimately before you were even born, consider, if you would, his holiness. And then, after doing that, approach his throne. And as 1 Peter 5, verse 7 says, then cast all your anxiety upon him, for he cares for you. And so after I finished writing this lesson, I thought, maybe on second thought, a little amnesia about ourselves wouldn't be such a bad thing. I try and give you a challenge every week, and it's a challenge to you, it's a challenge to me. Hopefully you have a very active prayer life. But the next time you stop to pray, would you not engage in speech and thought? Would you first pause for just a moment to consider who you're speaking to? Consider the God to whom you are offering your prayer and your worship is the God who created you in a billion galaxies and caterpillars with 288 muscles in their head and a square foot patch in the Amazon jungle that has over 3,000 different species of trees and a 1 square acre area. That is a pretty amazing God. And if we will get over ourselves for just a moment and consider to whom we are offering our prayer, I think it will help our prayer life, because then we understand the context in which our prayers are being given. It's not to go to a God in the kind of fashion that we see, asking for certain stuff that makes sense for us. We're going to the God who created the universe and who created us, and asking for his intervention in our life. And if he hates sin so much that he has to punish it, and he did so by punishing his son, Jesus Christ, who was sinless, then God must hate sin, but must love us a lot. And that's why John says in chapter 3, verse 16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that through him you might have life forever. And follows that up by saying he didn't send his Son into the world to what? Condemn the world, but that through him the world might be saved. So this week, as you engage our God in prayer, pause, if you would, to consider his holiness, his eternal aspect, his greatness, his justice, and consider also that he knows you and has numbered the very number of hairs on your head. I'm losing them faster than I can name them. So if God knows the very number of hairs on my head, what an amazing God we worship. So Arlene, can you go to the next one? Oh, by the way, can you go back to the goldfish? If you can't, that's fine. There you go. So spiritual amnesia, the goldfish saying, God who? And the reason why I did that is, I don't know if this has any scientific basis in truth. But what I've heard is that a goldfish, the reason why they swim around in a bowl is that by the time they arrive at the point from which they began that circle, they've forgotten that they were there. So they just swim around and around and around, because every trip is a new adventure. It's kind of like spiritual amnesia. We swim around and around and around, and everything is a new adventure. So Arlene, thank you. Next slide. So we're going to sing How Great Thou Art. I thought that would be a good song to kind of imprint on you what I've been trying to share with you. God's magnificence and his glory and what he's done for us. so that hopefully you leave today knowing that you invested your time in worshiping a God who is worth worshiping. And encourage your spirit and your heart to be able to go throughout your walk this week, knowing that you worship a living God who loves you so much that he gave his son Jesus to die for you so you could live with him forever. That's an amazing God, like the first song that we started out with this morning.